again, affirmative action, another well-intentioned policy intended to increase the ranks of the black middle class, increase the number of black college graduates. And I talk about it in this book mostly in the education sector and what it's done at the higher education level in particular. And what you have is a mismatch problem. And we saw that when California ended its ban on racial preferences back in 1996. What happened after that ban took place is that black graduation rates increased by more than 50%. Not only overall, but in some of the more difficult disciplines like math and science and engineering, again, by more than 50%. So a policy intended to help increase the number of black graduates was resulting in fewer doctors, fewer lawyers, fewer engineers than we otherwise would have had. Well, what happened is that these schools were funneling blacks into environments where they didn't match the educational credentials of the average student at the school. And so they were outmatched, and many of them dropped out or switched to easier majors. After the ban took place, kids were being better matched with schools where they could do the work, and therefore you had better graduation rates. But the way the whole affirmative action debate has evolved, graduation rates aren't the priority. Diversity is the priority. The campus has to look like America. The college catalog has to be properly color-coded. Whether kids are actually graduating is a secondary concern at best. The freshman class is what matters. And a good example of this in a nutshell is a study some years ago done of MIT, black kids at MIT. Black kids at MIT scored in the top 10% on the math section of the SAT of all kids in the country, of any color. But they were in the bottom 10% of scores on the math section of the SAT at MIT. So you have these very smart black kids who would be hitting it out of the park at a less selective school, but they're struggling at MIT. And MIT could care less because their campus looks like America.
All right, so one response to the gap, again, I return to this gap between African Americans and other Americans, affirmative action. Which brings us back to your alma mater, Harvard. According to
I'll never live it down.
You'll never live it down, yes. You once told me that the principal benefit of a Harvard degree was never again having to be impressed by anybody who had a Harvard degree. Is that right?
Absolutely.
All right. So these are figures that were published in the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper. In the Harvard class of 2019, these are the kids who will be graduating next June, the average SAT score for black students was 2149. By the way, these are all good scores, but for black students, 2149, white students, 2218, Asian students, 2300. Well, now that must be reasonable because it's taking place at Harvard, the seat of reason.
Well, that wasn't quite how I described it when I was there.
Affirmative action. Is that we ought not to be doing this?
You know, there are various laws and policies that benefit one group at the expense of another. But I think affirmative action has the distinction of being one that it harms everybody, though in different ways. And so there's a lot of evidence that there are black kids who have all the qualifications to be successes in college, who nevertheless are failures because they are systematically mismatched with institutions whose standards they don't meet, even though they may meet the standards of 80 or 90% of the colleges in America. I remember first aware of this when I was teaching at Cornell, and I found that half the black students at Cornell were on some kind of academic probation. And so I went over to the administration building and looked up the SATs of these students. The average black student at Cornell at that time scored at the 75th percentile.
Which is pretty darn good.
Yes. And so that means that in most colleges in this country, they would have no trouble, and many of them would be on the dean's list. But at Cornell, the average liberal arts student at that time was in the 99th percentile. And when you're teaching the students like that, you teach at a pace that most people of any race cannot keep up with. And it was always complained that I was assigning all kinds of reading. But heck, I'm teaching kids who are in the top 1%. They can keep up with the reading that I'm assigning.
So Cornell was taking very talented black kids and spending 4 years teaching them to feel inadequate.
Yes, and succeeding at that.